To every terrorist thug smuggling poisonous drugs into the United States of America, please be warned that we will blow you out of existence. That's what we're doing. We have no choice. At 6:12 in the morning, 18 nautical miles off the Venezuelan coast, a quiet stretch of international water turned into the flashpoint of a crisis. The USCGC Stone, a Legend-class national security cutter armed with a 57mm deck gun, was moving north along a known drug transit corridor. The radar picture was clean. The crew was settling into the first daylight watch, and nothing suggested that danger was already closing in. Then the first rounds hit. Heavy 14.5mm fire ripped across the water and slammed into the Stone's aft rail and antenna mounts, throwing sparks across the deck. Alarms erupted. Crew members sprinted to battle stations. On the bridge, the commanding officer had only seconds to decide whether to evade hold course or fire back. What should have been a routine counter-narcotics patrol had just become a direct attack on a U.S. vessel in international waters, and one with political consequences far beyond the horizon. Before we move on, ask yourself this: if a foreign patrol boat opened fire on an American cutter at sunrise, what would you expect that crew to do in the first 10 seconds? Join Titan Navy by liking and subscribing, and stay informed as the situation in the Caribbean evolves. The confrontation that unfolded that morning was not some isolated misunderstanding. It was the product of weeks of rising friction in the Southern Caribbean. Where the U.S. Coast Guard, U.S. Navy, and federal intelligence agencies had been tracking a surge of narcotics departures from Venezuelan waters. Every cutter on station had been warned that the region was heating up, and the USCGC Stone found itself positioned directly along one of the busiest smuggling corridors in the hemisphere. The Stone was there legally, operating outside the 12 nautical mile boundary that defines Venezuela's territorial waters. In international law, those miles matter. Outside that limit, a Coast Guard cutter has every right to patrol interdict suspicious vessels and enforce counter-narcotics operations under long-standing agreements with regional partners. That is exactly what the Stone was doing in the hours before the first shot was fired, methodically scanning surface contacts along a route that has carried tons of cocaine northward every year. That morning, one contact in particular drew attention. A small vessel moving north with its AIS transponder shut off had been weaving erratically across the current. Crews on cutters see dark contacts all the time, but this one behaved like a smuggler trying to mask a rendezvous or shadow larger traffic as cover. The Stone's sensors tracked its speed fluctuations, odd drift patterns, and refusal to broadcast identity. The cutter adjusted course slightly to maintain surveillance, but the broader situation around them was shifting fast. Days earlier, American officials had warned publicly that several drug boats departing Venezuelan harbors appeared to be operating with cartel support. Washington framed it as a law enforcement issue. Caracas countered fiercely, accusing the United States of intruding on its sovereign coastal zone and militarizing counter-narcotics patrols. The Venezuelan government says that happened within its economic exclusion zone. In other words, essentially on its territory on the ocean. That tension did not sit in the background. It colored every decision being made on the water. So when a Venezuelan patrol boat appeared on radar and unexpectedly closed distance with the Stone, the watch team did not treat it lightly. Initial assumptions were cautious. Perhaps an inspection attempt, perhaps a navigational misunderstanding. But standard maritime behavior dictates certain things: radio calls, identification, signals, a predictable approach vector. The Venezuelan boat provided none of those. It came in fast at a tightening angle, as though trying to box the Stone in or test its response. The Stones Bridge began running procedures. Helm maintained steady speed. Fire control remained inactive, but ready. Communications monitored every frequency for an incoming hail that never arrived. The crew had been trained for tense inspections and unpredictable foreign behavior. But what happened next crossed far beyond any script. Without warning, a burst of 14.5 mm fire cracked across the water and tore into the Stone's aft section. It is important to understand what that means. A 14.5 mm round is not a message. It is not a warning. It is an anti-material weapon originally designed to pierce armor plate, disable engines, and rip through hardened mounts. Militaries use it to kill equipment, not to communicate intent. When those rounds impact, steel sailors do not wonder what the shooter meant. The meaning is already clear. The crew reacted instantly. Impact alarms sounded. Flight deck hands hit the deck. Gunners' mates sprinted to weapon stations. On the bridge, the commanding officer grasped the severity immediately. A foreign state vessel had just fired live rounds at a U.S. cutter operating in international waters. It was a line few nations ever dare cross, and it had just been crossed by a patrol boat barely the size of the Stone's flight deck. In that moment, the careful balance between diplomacy and defense collapsed. The Stone could not assume the fire would stop. It could not assume the attackers knew what they were doing. It could not assume the next burst would miss the bridge or the engine room. A decision had to be made fast, and the reality was simple. Once the first round was fired, the Stone had only one response left. The first burst of incoming fire left no doubt about intent, and the crew of the USCGGC Stone moved with the kind of discipline that only comes from years of training. The moment the rounds struck the aft rail, the bridge shifted from watch-standing mode to full defensive posture. The commanding officer issued the authorization that every cutter carries in its rulebook, but rarely has to invoke return fire to protect the ship and crew. Within seconds, the Stone's fire control system came alive. Electro-optical sensors stabilized. Range data populated across the display. Automated tracking locked onto the hostile vessel's silhouette, skipping unevenly across the waves. The cutter's primary weapon, the Mk110 57mm deck gun, rotated smoothly on its mount. Unlike the crude, manually aimed 14.5mm gun that had just fired on the Stone, the 57mm system is engineered for precision. It integrates radar tracking, optical confirmation, and a stabilized fire control computer that can keep rounds on target even in heavy seas. That morning, the water was calm, and the conditions favored the American crew. At the weapons console, the gunner's mate verified target lock. The hostile vessel was close enough that its wake was visible through the EO camera, yet far enough that the Stone still had tactical space to respond. The commanding officer gave the order, and the cutter's bow erupted in a sharp, controlled flash. The first burst of 57mm fire cut across the water in a tight, deliberate pattern. These were not warning shots. They were not intended to intimidate. They were fired exactly as the Coast Guard's rules of engagement prescribe, aimed to disable the threat while minimizing unnecessary damage. The rounds impacted just forward of the Venezuelan vessel's engine line, forcing the patrol boat to sheer slightly as shrapnel sprayed across its deck. The gunner shifted aim as the fire control system compensated for the patrol boat's evasive turn. The second burst landed closer to the cabin, striking the mounting point of the 14.5mm gun that had initiated the attack. Through the Stone's optical sensors, the crew could see the hostile gunners scrambling away from the destroyed weapon mount smoke, beginning to boil up from the damaged deck plating. Despite taking hits, the Venezuelan boat did not immediately withdraw. It attempted to close distance again, a risky move that placed it directly into the path of the cutter's arc of fire. The stone responded with a third tightly controlled volley, this time aimed at the vessel's upper structure, where sensors and controls were likely housed. Several rounds struck the cabin area, forcing the patrol boat to yaw violently to port. A column of dark smoke rose as another internal component failed. At no point did the stone's crew exceed their rules of engagement. Every burst was measured. Every impact was assessed in real time. The objective was not to sink the Venezuelan vessel. It was to stop it from continuing an armed attack. The discipline on display was the product of a service that has spent decades balancing law enforcement missions with combat-ready protocols, a force that understands that even in crisis restraint is part of strength. The Venezuelan patrol boat finally began to lose maneuverability. With smoke trailing from the cabin and debris scattered across its upper decks, the vessel slowed, hesitated, and then turned south, angling back toward the territorial waters it had come from. The stone maintained tracking, but did not pursue. The cutter held position, keeping its bow oriented toward the retreating threat, ready for another engagement, but refusing to escalate beyond necessary force. Within minutes, the hostile vessel was little more than a smudge on the horizon. What remained visible was the thick plume of smoke that marked its damaged systems and the unmistakable message it carried home. Attacking a U.S. cutter, even with surprise and proximity, would not end on favorable terms. On the Stone's bridge, the crew quickly transitioned from combat to assessment. Damage teams checked the aft section for structural compromise. Weapons officers reviewed ammunition expenditure and confirmed that the 57mm system was ready for further use if required. Communications relayed a full battle report up the chain of command. Everything was recorded, logged, documented, an essential step in any engagement involving state actors. But there was another truth in the air that morning. The Stone's response, as precise and restrained as it was, would not be the end of the confrontation. The United States never allows an attack on one of its vessels to stand on its own. The cutter had defended itself, but the broader machinery of American sea power had already begun to move. And the fight was not over, because every attack on a U.S. ship brings something far larger in its wake. For the crew of the USCGC Stone, the gunfight ended the moment the Venezuelan patrol boat vanished into the haze. But for the wider U.S. chain of command, the incident was just beginning. A state vessel had fired on an American cutter operating in international waters, an act that triggers a response protocol far above the pay grade of any single ship's captain. The Stone's communications team moved quickly. Battle damage imagery was transmitted within minutes. Impact points on the aft rail, scorched antenna mounts, sensor logs showing the trajectory of incoming fire, and high-resolution footage of the Venezuelan patrol boat retreating under smoke. The cutter's navigational data confirmed its distance 18 nautical miles from the Venezuelan coastline, well outside any territorial claim. Everything was documented, time-stamped, and sent up the chain with a simple summary: attacked, returned fire situation stable but unresolved. Within the regional command center, that message was not treated as a skirmish. It was treated as a potential international incident. The United States does not allow ambiguity when a foreign government fires on its military vessels. Even if the platform is only a Coast Guard cutter, every branch understands the same principle. A hit on one is a hit on the uniform itself. That is why, less than 10 minutes after the Stone's initial report orders went out to 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, already operating in the Caribbean, USS Gravely and USS Porter. Both ships had been conducting presence patrols tied to the broader 2025 maritime security posture, an expanded U.S. footprint meant to blunt cartel traffic, deter hostile regimes, and reassure regional partners. Their normal patrol pattern kept them far enough apart to cover a wide swath of ocean, but close enough to mutually reinforce within a few hours. The Stone's report collapsed that spacing instantly. The destroyers turned toward the cutter at flank speed. These ships are not symbolic assets. Each is a 9,000-ton warship equipped with the Aegis Combat System vertical launch cells capable of firing SM-2 and ESSM surface-to-air missiles, long-range Tomahawks, and a full suite of defense tools designed to control the airspace and sea lanes around them. Their arrival is not a gesture. It is a message written in steel. As the sun rose, the Gravely was the first to appear over the horizon, its silhouette emerging from the morning light like a dark wedge of armor. Minutes later, the Porter followed, approaching from a different vector to establish a layered formation. From the Stone's bridge, the view was unmistakable. Two U.S. destroyers positioning themselves between the cutter and the Venezuelan coastline, forming what sailors often call a wall of steel. The image alone carried diplomatic weight. Any radar operator watching from the Venezuelan side would see two distinct Aegis signatures interposing themselves in a deliberate shield posture. That formation sent a clear, uncomplicated warning. Any further aggression would be answered by something far beyond a single cutter's deck gun. The Gravely assumed the lead position closest to the Venezuelan coast. Its sensors pointed inland, absorbing and mapping every radar pulse and electronic emission from shore. The Porter positioned itself farther out, covering the broader air and sea approaches. Meanwhile, the Stone held the center slot, protected, not passive, ready to report, document, and continue its lawful mission. From above, the scene looked like textbook American naval doctrine: protect the vulnerable unit, escalate the defensive envelope, and stabilize the environment with overwhelming capability. The Caribbean has seen countless Coast Guard operations over the decades, but it is only when Navy destroyers arrive that the full weight of U.S. power becomes visible. And make no mistake, the presence of two destroyers was intentional. One would have been enough to ensure safety. Two sends a different message entirely. It says, "We are not reacting. We are establishing control." Regional analysts noted something else. In 2025, the Caribbean had become a complex battle space. Cartel-linked fast boats were operating with more sophistication. Venezuelan military units had become bolder in challenging U.S. patrols. Intelligence indicated foreign advisors were increasingly active in the region. Against that backdrop, the sudden appearance of two heavily armed destroyers was a demonstration of both readiness and resolve. For the Stone's crew still inspecting battle damage and resetting their stations, the arrival of the Gravely and Porter was more than reassurance. It was a reminder that no Coast Guard vessel, no matter how isolated its patrol route, ever operates alone. Behind every cutter lies a layered network of surveillance aircraft, strike-capable ships, and rapid response forces ready to intervene the moment a threat crosses the line. But while the destroyer's presence stabilized the area, it also raised a more uncomfortable question. If a single rogue patrol boat could trigger a response of this magnitude, what would happen if something larger, something intentional occurred next? Was this simply deterrence or the first hint of a larger confrontation waiting just beyond the horizon? The moment the USS Gravely and USS Porter positioned themselves between the USCGC Stone and the Venezuelan coastline, the confrontation began shifting from the tactical realm to the political arena, where every word carried as much weight as every round fired on the water. Caracas, seeking to seize the narrative first, announced that the gunfire had been nothing more than a misidentification error, insisting that its patrol boat had reacted under the belief that an unknown vessel was probing sensitive maritime zones, and that the burst of 14.5mm fire reflected confusion rather than intent. Washington, however, responded with a firmly documented rebuttal, emphasizing that the stone had been operating far beyond the 12 nautical mile boundary, conducting a lawful counter-narcotics patrol, and that the Venezuelan vessel had neither issued a radio call nor attempted any form of identification before opening fire. Instead of reinforcing Venezuela's claims of confusion, the video transmitted by the stone clearly showed the Venezuelan patrol boat closing distance with its weapon, elevated its AIS signature irregular, and the unmistakable muzzle flash of heavy machine gun fire cutting across the waves. As both versions reached international audiences, the gap between them widened in a way that made compromise nearly impossible. Analysts across multiple networks pointed out that 14 5mm rounds are never classified as warning fire, since naval protocols worldwide reserve them for fully lethal engagements, and that even countries with strained relations rarely allow their patrol craft to escalate without attempting communication. Maritime law specialists added that the geographic data alone undermined Caracas's justification because no interpretation of territorial norms places a U.S. cutter 18 nautical miles offshore inside Venezuelan waters. Despite these realities, Venezuelan officials began adjusting their message throughout the day, shifting from the language of accidental engagement to accusations that U.S. patrols were operating provocatively close to their maritime borders. That shift, rather than clarifying the situation, highlighted the political pressure within Caracas, where acknowledging responsibility could undermine both domestic legitimacy and regional influence. Meanwhile, American officials maintained a single position that the attack was unprovoked illegal and potentially tied to broader patterns of cartel-aligned activity in the region. This clash of narratives created an information battleground that extended far beyond diplomatic communiques. Cable news programs filled their screens with satellite maps, AIS plots, and slow-motion analysis of muzzle flashes. Commentators debated rules of engagement, questioned Venezuela's shifting explanations, and warned that even a brief firefight at sea can spiral into wider conflict if governments perceive strategic intent rather than human error. On social platforms, users circulated high-resolution radar captures and vessel tracking data, creating a parallel layer of civilian analysis that amplified global attention on the standoff. While the public argued over which government was telling the truth, the strategic consequences became undeniable. Every confrontation at sea, especially one involving state vessels, forces both countries to demonstrate resolve, and Washington could not afford to treat the attack lightly without signaling vulnerability to other actors in the region. Likewise, Caracas, already under economic and political strain, could not afford to appear subordinate to U.S. power without risking internal fractures within its military hierarchy. As tensions hardened, regional movements shifted accordingly. Merchant ships reported unusual Venezuelan patrol patterns. U.S. reconnaissance flights expanded their coverage arcs, and the two destroyers guarding the stone adjusted their posture to maximize deterrence while avoiding actions that might trigger escalation. The Caribbean, once a routine operating space, became an arena where a single mistake could carry consequences far beyond the horizon. Yet the most consequential development was not broadcast in press conferences or argued on talk shows because the real turning point emerged from within Venezuela's own command structure, where information leaked that fundamentally challenged the government's narrative. The order to fire had not come from the officer Caracas claimed to defend, and the identity of the true decision-maker would change everything. In the hours after the firefight, the political fallout inside Venezuela accelerated quickly, especially once the patrol boat's captain was quietly detained, a move that contradicted the government's claim of misidentification and exposed deeper fractures within its naval chain of command. Washington interpreted the arrest as an implicit acknowledgement of wrongdoing, Rather than easing its response, U.S. officials emphasized that no internal disciplinary action could erase the fact that a U.S. cutter had been fired upon in international waters, which elevated the incident from a tactical error to a direct challenge to American authority. While Caracas attempted to cool tensions through calls for restraint, the Stone returned to its mission under dramatically altered conditions, now operating beneath a continuous Navy security umbrella formed by the Gravely, the Porter, and a rotating network of P-8 patrol aircraft and drones. This reinforced posture signaled a broader strategic shift, since the United States recognized that Coast Guard crews working near Venezuelan waters were no longer facing only traffickers, but also the possibility of state-backed escalation, which blurred the traditional separation between law enforcement patrols and forward military presence. As U.S. commanders adopted this new model, planners highlighted how a joint Navy-Coast Guard posture would deter further incidents, test adversary behavior, and stabilize a region where criminal networks and political tension increasingly overlap. Meanwhile, Venezuela struggled with the political cost of its shifting explanations as military officers questioned whether the government had pushed its own navy into a confrontation it could never hope to win. Across the Caribbean shipping lanes, shifted regional partners, increased intelligence sharing, and Coast Guard crews received new guidance reflecting a more dangerous operating environment. What began as a brief clash at sea had quietly reshaped the balance of power across an entire theater. From this point onward, the central issue was no longer the shots already fired, but the ones that might follow. The confrontation that began with a burst of 45mm fire ended with a clear demonstration of how the United States responds when its crews come under attack. The USCGC Stone absorbed the first strike, returned accurate 57mm fire that forced the Venezuelan patrol boat to retreat, and held its position until 2 U.S. destroyers arrived to draw a firm line across the Caribbean. By the time Caracas shifted its narrative and detained its own captain, the strategic picture had already been set. The United States would not allow ambiguity, and the region understood exactly who controlled the sea. This incident reinforced a simple truth that often goes unnoticed. America's strength does not come only from advanced ships or powerful weapons, but from the discipline of its crews, the speed of its command decisions, and the unmatched reach of its naval forces. The United States does not seek confrontation in the Caribbean, yet it will never step back when its vessels are targeted. Looking ahead, tensions will remain high as Venezuela tests boundaries, cartels exploit uncertainty, and regional actors adjust their posture. But U.S. presence will continue to anchor stability across these waters. America's strength protects every lane, every ship, every crew. If you want more breakdowns of real frontline confrontations like this video, subscribe to Titan Navy, and see you next time.